Welcome. My name is John Windhausen. I'm the head of the Schools Health and Libraries Broadband Coalition, or Shelby Coalition. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar today called Lessons Learned from the ECF program to enhance the E-rate program. This webinar is particularly timely because just 5 days ago, the FCC chairwoman announced a new initiative called Learning Without Limits, which would provide E-rate support for schools and libraries to provide ongoing support for devices, devices and services. Well, that's what we'll talk about, is what is eligible under this new announcement. But the FCC's announcement follows the very successful ECF program, the Emergency Connectivity Fund. Congress had appropriated over $7 billion for the ECF program 2 years ago, and that program has led to the funding of over 13 million devices, connected devices, and over 8 million broadband connections. So the ECF program has gone a long way towards trying to address the homework gap, where a lot of students and library patrons have not been able to access the internet from home. And the ECF program has done a lot of good work in order to meet that demand. The problem is that the ECF program is going to be running out of funding soon. With Shelby's help, we were able to extend the deadline for the ECF funding until June 30th of 2024, but the amount of funding left over is not very much. And the big question on everybody's mind is, how do we continue the progress of the ECF program? And what is our long-term strategy? Well, fortunately, we have three wonderful and very experienced panelists who are going to help us understand the ECF program, its benefits and some of its challenges. And they're going to help us devise a long-term strategy for what the FCC should do going forward. So before I turn things over to our panelists, let me just review some of the logistics. Our webinar is made possible by the support of our corporate sponsors, ENA and Broadband.money. All audience members are muted, but I do encourage you to use the chat feature. And I will be doing my best to field the questions that you put into the chat and relay them to the panelists throughout this webinar. Just as a reminder too, this webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the recorded version of this webinar on the Shelby website by tomorrow. Also, feel free to follow us on social media at the Shelby Coalition, or join with the hashtag Shelby Webinars. So with those logistics covered, I'm very pleased to introduce our three panelists today. I'm pleased to welcome Clint Odom, who is the Vice President of Strategic Alliances and External Affairs at T-Mobile. Then we'll hear from Misty Hawkins, the Library Director at the Arkansas River Valley Regional Library System. And then third, we'll hear from Russ Selken, who is the Chief Technology Officer of the Modesto City Schools in California. Welcome to all three of you. We've asked each panelist to speak for about 8 minutes for their opening remarks. And then that will take up the first half hour, and that will leave us the second half hour to field your questions. So with that introduction, Clint, very pleased to turn the microphone over to you. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, John. And thank you, Shelby, for inviting us. I've not had a chance to work directly with Misty or Russ, but I know that they are really tops in their field. And I want to thank them for all that they do to make sure that America's schools and libraries and patrons remain connected to the internet, regardless of what's going on in the wider economy. As John mentioned, Congress allocated about $7 billion to ECFS about 2 years ago, which enables anchor institutions, including schools and libraries, to be able to provide crucial broadband access to homes during the pandemic. From our perspective at T-Mobile, ECF was a rousing success. It helped to connect millions of students, teachers, and library staff for remote learning during the COVID pandemic. Congress understood that even though most schools were closed, schoolwork just couldn't stop for months or maybe longer, even though the record showed that in fact happened in some really regrettable cases. This congressionally funded experiment really helped to demonstrate something that T-Mobile has long been advocating. Learning doesn't end at the classroom door, with or without a pandemic. So having connectivity at home, including at shelters and group homes, during travel to and from schools, is especially crucial for narrowing the homework gap in low-income communities in particular. What are some of the lessons that we learned during this period? I'd say probably the first is that E-rate dollars, unlike ECF funding, can be used solely for wiring schools and for connectivity within schools themselves. Now, schools and libraries can choose mobile wireless as their E-rate provider. Cannot choose mobile wireless as their E-rate provider for wiring schools, except only in the narrowest of circumstances. And this is because mobile wireless has been deemed a higher cost solution than wired broadband, even though schools don't have to pay for mobile wireless maintenance or switching out wired and Wi-Fi systems when technology becomes obsolete. So the Emergency Connectivity Fund exposed that E-rate programs' major limitation is that students did not want to turn in their devices and their tablets when they left the classroom. Now, this has always made sense if you are a student in a wealthy school district or system. Of course, their students have internet access at home, and everyone has a cell phone for traveling and on buses. But at the beginning of COVID, vulnerable students, often from communities of color, discovered that not only was doing homework a serious problem, but they were completely cut off from their schools, classmates, and teachers. I'm always very proud to cite a statistic that Shelby was involved in the Kansas City, Missouri school district, which found that some 45% of the students during the pandemic never switched on to remote learning, 45%, which is a stunning statistic. And I'm sure there's statistics like that all across the country. Not surprisingly, many students and teachers decided to spend their ECF money on T-Mobile services. They needed connectivity at home for classroom studies and homework, looking for jobs and internships, researching colleges, and so much more. But from experience, they knew they needed ubiquitous connectivity their peers from other schools relied upon. On the school bus, during sporting and other after-school events, while traveling and at jobs. Remember, learning happens everywhere. Teachers also wanted that same connectivity both in and out of school. Ironically, the pandemic and the ECF program helped provide that very connectivity for many students and teachers. So I can say that the biggest problem with ECF is that the funding will end. And John talked about that during his remarks. There will be a little left over that the FCC is currently distributing, but the program will come to an end. And although there has been great leadership demonstrated by Senator Markey and Grace Ming, Congresswoman Grace Ming, that would make ECF permanent, those bills, at least at the moment, do not appear to be advancing. Now, E-rate, for all of its merits, is not a substitute for ECF. Although our company has long advocated for a complete overhaul of the E-rate program, including allowing funding for remote learning and wireless broadband services, our company has concerns about the suitability of the E-rate program as the appropriate substitute vehicle. This is because there are so many demands on the USF program, of which E-rate is only one component. So ECF has taught us that funding for remote learning and to narrow the homework gap is desperately needed. But it's also taught us that an FCC program, depending upon contributions from a very narrow slice of users, can be problematic. So instead of trying for piecemeal fixes of the E-rate program that are commendable and laudable, we would hope there could be a sharper focus on efforts in Congress and the creation of a permanent ECF-like fund. In the meantime, we'd like to see the FCC provide more flexibility in existing E-rate programs to school districts and libraries to customize their programs to meet their needs, including allowing off-campus support and wireless service, if that is how districts choose to spend their money. Now, we know that the FCC is going to at some point, issue a notice of proposed rulemaking on what kinds of reforms we would like to see. And now I can't commit to what's going to be in that NPRM or even the position that T-Mobile might take in response to that NPRM, but there's an obvious appeal in funding Wi-Fi on school buses through the E-rate program. When presented as a student safety issue, it seems that Wi-Fi on school buses could alleviate several issues that are faced by drivers, parents, and districts alike. From students not getting on the bus to getting off at the wrong stop, to traffic issues, lost drivers, and even bullying. There are many use cases for the need to ensure that districts have the option to put Wi-Fi on school buses. And so I look forward to hearing more from the FCC. We've heard a lot from Jessica Rosenworcel on initiatives to meet these connectivity needs. We are very interested to see how that will look when it's finally reduced to writing in a notice of proposed rulemaking. And as always, encourage the FCC to use its existing authority in places where congressional action may not be required. So I look forward to hearing from my other co-panelists, and I thank you all for the opportunity to give some remarks this afternoon. John, back to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Clint. Very interesting that you're calling for more comprehensive overhaul of the E-rate program. I want to come back to you with that because that's very intriguing. But let's move on now to our next speaker, Misty Hawkins, the Library Director for the Arkansas River Valley Regional Library System. Go ahead, Misty.
Hi. So I am, of course, the library director of the Arkansas River Valley Regional Library System, and I became library director on March 16th of 2020. So that was the most awful time to begin. But I learned a lot about E-rate very quickly, and I'm going to actually touch on how we have received funding through E-rate and utilize the ECF program to distribute hotspots and utilize a Wi-Fi antenna program for our libraries. So you see a picture right here of, this is what it feels like a lot of times in Arkansas, that we're just with our laptops out in the middle of a hayfield. But in reality, that's really not what it looks like at all. Next slide. This is what Arkansas looks like. This is what my hometown looks like. We are covered in rocks. We're just a lot of rocks, a lot of mountains. And so as you can imagine, we do not have very good cell service, let alone service that's in the ground. And it's very hard for all of our patrons and our libraries. So we are a 4-county regional library system. We cover approximately 3,000 square miles. And we have 35 staff members in all 7 locations, like total. So we rely heavily on the Universal Service Fund for programs like our E-rate and the ECF. And for E-rate initially during the pandemic, we had to really come up with something quickly to serve our communities. And so for E-rate, we utilized 3 Wi-Fi antennas at 3 of our locations, and we were very strategic in our locations. And we chose to put them in places where they are in parking lots, like right next to public parking lots, or they were right next to a Boys and Girls Club, or they were right next to a courthouse. So it would have parking, a parking lot rather than a residential area. So my problem with that right now is the fact that this is 3 years later and we are still cost allocating our offsite usage with E-rate funding, meaning if it is offsite, off of our property, we have had to calculate the usage that's off of our library property, and that does not qualify for E-rate funding. That's a problem for us, but we continue to meet the needs. We've got to continue to meet the needs. We took advantage of the ECF funding, and we got hotspots through our lending program, and we also received a few laptops, and we were able to do a hotspot lending program with that. And due to the privacy concerns for our patrons, we actually determined that wasn't a good program for our library, wasn't actually a good fit. So our second phase of that program actually led to us having a partnership with the Adult Learning Alliance. And so now we utilize our Adult Learning Alliance and the hotspots, and they keep their information, and the library isn't necessarily responsible for keeping all of the information on the people who are the participants. And we do not use ECF funding any longer, participate in that program. So next slide. I kind of named the presentation The Good, the Bad, and the Not So Ugly, because I wanted to really emphasize we have reached people with E-rate and with the ECF program, and the positives are outstanding. We have reached the underserved areas. These opportunities are available for libraries, which really means a lot. Public libraries, we need this sort of funding. We need access to this. We have new possible internet providers for our area. And then this allows us to expand programs and really educate the public on our needs. The bad parts of it, ECF was a horrible, the layout for it was horrible for small rural library systems. The portal did not even allow for us to have our E-rate, did not even allow for us to have our E-rate liaison through our state library to have access to our information. So she could not see any of our messaging. And so when there were requests made, it had a very short turnaround time, and I couldn't show her what needed to happen. And it was just completely different than E-rate. So it needed to be streamlined a little bit better. Just the inconsistency that needed to be resolved a little bit. And then the financial burden, now we are completely paying for our hotspot program out of pocket. And we chose to not continue the ECF program due to the fact that we couldn't receive any help from our internet provider. And so we're just taking our small equipment money, and it was a priority for us. People need the help. So next slide. And then as far as the not so ugly, I appreciate the funding. I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate that the FCC and USAC has they are rewarding us with funding, and that this is something that we need. But what could be done better? Reward people who have been sticking through this for the long term and not just coming in to get money here and there. And then also encourage innovation, encourage these people who have been putting Wi-Fi antennas on their building, and they've been doing it for 3 years, and they've been paying a penalty essentially for doing the right thing. And then also encourage capacity building, and which means like the partnerships and thinking outside the box and not just sticking to certain parameters, and putting hotspots on buses and going out there, like get rid of the red tape and allow the anchor institutions to really do what they do best, because they know these people who need the internet. And that's really my my most important part that I could share with in my presentation. I've really appreciated the opportunity to have the funding, and most of all, I feel like we have utilized everything that we've been given to the best of our ability. But I would like to see a little bit in the future. I would like to see the FCC maybe not necessarily utilize the hotspots, but really have an emphasis on the actual mapping and getting people internet all the time, like consistently. And then my last slide. This is my my contact information. And if you ever have any questions, if you would ever like any more information about Arkansas, about rural libraries, this information that I shared today is specifically about my library system, but this could easily be any library system in Arkansas. This could be easily a travel library. And I represent a lot of smaller libraries, and where if you do not have cell phone service, you don't have internet, and it's a huge void in a lot of our rural America. So that's it.
Very good. Thank you so much, Misty. A lot of really interesting nuggets of information that you provided to us in your opening comments that I want to come back to during the Q&A session. So thank you very much for that. But I also want to note right away your passion for this connectivity and the role that libraries are playing, and even to the extent that you're now paying for this out of pocket. You know, that's a great testament to your public service of the library. So congratulate you for that. So we'll come back to you, but next I'm really pleased to hear from Russ Selken with the Modesto City Schools in California. So Russ, please tell us about your experience.
All right, well, thanks, John. And first of all, I'm looking at this as what, the Navy SEALs call it after action review. So this isn't being critical. We're very thankful for what the FCC and USAC did in a very tight time frame under compelling circumstances. The world reacted, and it's the first time we've had to be in that situation to get access to our students immediately. Just a little background on our situation here in Modesto in California. We have about 30,000 students with 34 school sites. High poverty, we get about a 90% discount on our Category 1 services. So a lot of demand and need. We even have families where they're living in a garage, and so they can't get internet access because of the fact that the carriers won't take it to 2 spots in a single household. So very dynamic environment there with a lot of challenges. But just the background of what we did during COVID is that we took a lot of our old, everyone was struggling to get Chromebooks, right? So we took about 10,000 of our old Windows computers and loaded Neverware and turned them into Chromebooks. The next step was, what is out there and existing? So we worked with Internet Essentials, and we basically educated our family in bilingual ways to let them know to go and sign up if they had the means and the resources for that $10 a month. So we didn't just jump right into buying hotspots. We got them ordered. But in the meantime, we tried to get everyone connected with that strategy, because we all know landline for those situations seem to be a little bit easier to support in the long run relative to some of our customers, which that's what I call our parents and students as our customers. So once we got that rolling out, we did order about 1,500 hotspots and got them out to our students as quickly as possible. We did it like an in-and-out drive-through. I don't know, Whataburger, maybe that's on the East Coast, but they would drive through because of COVID and pick up their hotspot or their device. And we did that in a matter of about 2 to 3 weeks, working 7 days a week and some long hours. So that gives you the context of how we set up our internet access. And I have to say, I really, like my colleagues here on this call, endorse the idea in the long run that in terms of learning without limits aspects, that it's a new paradigm shift. In order for this nation to continue with its educational leadership in the world, which also leads to a better economy in the world, we have to give our students access at home. It's just a huge paradigm shift. And in California, we have this act called the Williams Act that was passed a number of years ago, where students had both a textbook at school and at home. And I look at internet access as now replacing that, because a lot of the publishers have finally got on board and digitizing their content, dynamic information that also gives our students the ability to learn at their own pace. So it is a paradigm shift. There's no doubt about it that our students need access at home, and some of them have the means. And then in order for us to be a public education nation, we have to help out those students that don't have that access for various reasons. So that's kind of the background and the history. I think lessons learned, and again, this is not being critical of USAC, the FCC, they did an amazing job in a short period of time. But one of the things is what I would call monitoring the usage. In the first year, the rules were very unclear, and a lot of my peers were very nervous about applying for it because there is a stigma and of applying for federal funds that if you do something wrong, you get an audit, but it's not till 5 years later, and all of a sudden you're paying back funds. So there is that stigma that I'll maybe get into in a few minutes here, but we would look at it as there's a lot of administrative overhead in the sense that you have to be careful of waste, fraud, and abuse. One thing to look at it is that I think my colleagues are concerned about the ECF being imaged into E-rate. E-rate has grown a lot. It's essential to our infrastructure at our educational system. There's been a lot of continuous improvements in working out waste, fraud, and abuse, but you can look at ECF as being in its infancy. We just don't want legislatures that have a lot on their plate to associate ECF with E-rate if there is some waste, fraud, and abuse issues. And that's one of the things I have to say. Just the administrative burden makes it a little daunting for a lot of school districts when they look at it. And I'll give you an example that was one of those unintended consequences. Again, we were all running fast in that first year of COVID, window 1 of ECF, just applying, getting the devices. The carriers did an outstanding job trying to help out this nation, getting connected as quickly as possible so that we can minimize the learning loss, keep students engaged in education. And if you went ahead and paid for those, and waited for the ECF discounts to come, so to speak, then if you used ESSER or COVID funds, federal funds that were related to ESSER or COVID, then you automatically were not eligible for ECF. And then as soon as you get that type of issue where all of a sudden 12 months into a program, 18 months into a program, as an IT director that has a lot on their plate or a business services person, then you have a stigma of your concerns about that program, because we all have all of us have this view is that we never want to do anything wrong and use funds inappropriately. And so when the rules get rolled out and they're not maybe clear up front, I'd say that's one of the lessons learned. Again, very much a proponent of ECF and a lot of the value that it added to our education, and it's just a necessity in the new 21st century environment. I think the other part of it is I was able to turn this opportunity, and I'm thinking about it in a long-term sustainability, and hopefully my colleagues and peers with everything they got on their plate can look at it this way. As I started looking for a local WISP, Ayera, and seeing what we can maybe do to partner up on getting internet access. And fortunately, they have a lot of areas that they don't have coverage that our schools are at. So we're giving them free space, antenna space on our schools and power. They do, for the E-rate people out there, I'm keeping the internet access to that separate because they will have some of their customers, not just our students. That's their cost, that's their bandwidth. And then in lieu of that, they're giving us about 600 free accounts for our students. So that's an idea that, not everybody has that same opportunity, but we have to look at it and be innovative and creative and ensure that there's not federal rules, whether they're ACP, ECF, or E-rate funds, to impede those innovation ideas in order to get our students connected. So that's kind of like the background that we had at our district, some of the challenges we had with it. And I kind of look at it as, I know that there's this, I guess, momentum to associate ECF and E-rate in some of the way that the processes are rolled out, because at the end of the day, it is the school that's responsible for these students' education and their access. But I do hope that we can build legislative walls so that in terms of program walls, so that legislatures can see that there is a difference between ECF and E-rate in terms of administrations and process and funding structures. Because I just do not want any stigma that someone may have in the long run as we work out the kinks with ECF to associate it to E-rate and damage the image of what that rate program's evolved to over the last, it feels like 40 years, but it's only been 26 years of E-rate that does a lot of good in our schools to date. So that's kind of the lesson learned that I can see is also making it sustainable, just like I'm trying to, on my local basis, look at sustainable internet access for our students. I want to make sure that any programs that we get utilized, that they have sustainability and political structure. That one of the speakers today talked about is that how do we fund it? What's the most logical way to fund it? And that it's not like soft funds, so to speak. So that's a little bit about our story and some of the lessons learned from both local basis of sustainability and as well as how we look at some federal programs. But again, I want to tell Shelby, thanks for the opportunity of sharing our story here, as well as thanks the FCC and USAC for the hard work of getting our students connected during kind of a compelling situation that hasn't happened to this country before. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Russ. So very interesting perspective you're sharing. I want to come back to you about that in a few moments, but let's bring all the three panelists back up on screen here now. And Clint, I guess I'd like to start with you and pick up where you left off with your presentation, where you mentioned that T-Mobile has long been an advocate for more comprehensive reform of the E-rate program. So can you tell us a little bit more about what T-Mobile is looking to do and what
Sure.
your advocacy efforts are focused on?
Yes. So although today we're almost exclusively focused on the E-rate program and ECF, this is just one of the programs that is funded by the Universal Service Program. There are programs that are focused on low income. There are programs focused on areas of the country that are underserved. There's a program dealing with telemedicine, and of course, what we all have come to know as E-rate. All of these programs are funded by a bill, a fee that's imposed on the bill of most broadband and telephone users, and that fee is based on a tax that almost today doesn't really make sense. It's a very narrow set of users who engage in calls, I think, within a state. And that is a shrinking source of revenue because most calls and most traffic is internet-based, and is not only does it not take place within the borders of a state, but they take place across borders all over the world. If I make a call to Misty on my IP phone, that call may be broken up and sent, to all of the world, and then reassembled at her phone, in Arkansas. And so, if we have a funding mechanism that is shrinking, and over time just continues to click upward and upward and upward, it's a system that is not sustainable. This isn't T-Mobile's opinion. This is the opinion of even the FCC, which has expressed concern over this funding mechanism. As is many disputes, Congress perhaps has to step in and fix certain things, but there are always things that Congress can do. The FCC can do within its own jurisdiction to sort of address these things, but ultimately the way that universal service is funded is going to need to change. And now that the courts have really upheld the authority of the FCC to act, and has upheld the legitimacy of this delegation of authority from the FCC to USAC, it's time to really keep that momentum going, and for us to get some reform around that so-called contribution methodology, because all of these programs can't rely on an unstable source of funding. Either there's going to have to be a regular appropriation, as we discussed, for E-rate or ECF or one of its successor programs, or we're going to have to rely on the goodness of school districts to pay for these services, and for companies like T-Mobile to continue to offer, especially to low-income families and students, programs like Project 10 Million that gives 5 years of free internet connectivity to students who participate in the free or reduced school lunch program. Not a sustainable program, not a federal program, but is at least one example of how one company is trying to step into the breach here that's left by public policy.
Well, that's a position that Shelby certainly agrees with, Clint, that the existing funding mechanism is not sustainable. And we need to find a long-term replacement strategy, because continuing to put a fee on telephone service as a way to fund broadband services doesn't make sense. So, Shelby has been an advocate for assessing broadband services to pay into the fund, because that's largely what the broadband, or what the USF is funding to pay out of the fund. So we think that would, but let's not go down that road too far, because that opens up a whole lot of other questions. I do want to focus mostly on the ECF and E-rate program. So you also mentioned that the E-rate program currently doesn't support wireless services. And I wondered if you could just explain a little bit more about that situation. And is that something that you're trying to correct in E-rate?
Right. Well, wireless is different, as we like to say, and the way regulators look at our business, is also different. Stepping aside from E-rate and ECF for a second, just this week, the administration announced for over $40 billion of funding that's going to go out to fund infrastructure projects throughout the United States, in all 50 states and the territories. That funding, for the most part, for the overwhelming majority of that funding, will not be used to fund wireless. There is a view held by some that wireless is not the gold standard for broadband. There are many places where the public policy preference is for fiber. Well, there are lots of places where fiber doesn't make sense. It can't be built fast enough, doesn't meet the needs of a highly mobile workforce, family structure, employees, what have you. But it's a policy preference that's been expressed, and it's found its way, into the administration of this grant program. Similarly, there's a view that wireless is more expensive. And I think this sort of goes back to the early days of wireless, when you only saw well-to-do people riding around in their cars with a cell phone, screwed into their floorboard, that wireless is just expensive. The truth of the matter is, over time, wireless has become a much faster and much more efficient way to deploy broadband connectivity than many of its fixed broadband options. So, most days I'm fighting this fight to explain to people why wireless is a legitimate alternative. Home internet, another example. Wireless is proving itself now to be a real competitor to cable and the telcos in this space, and is a lot less expensive to consumers to use. So we've got a job to do in our business, and we will continue to do it to make the case why we think wireless meets the needs of a modern student, teacher, library, healthcare system. And hopefully, if we're successful, we can start to see some of these changes seeping in to our public policy, whether it be the way that USAC or the FCC administers a program, or in the way that Congress and the Commerce Department think about allocating federal dollars to help close the broadband gap throughout the country.
Well, very good. Thank you for elaborating on that, Clint. That's very helpful. I want to turn to Misty now. And if I could just understand a little bit more of your experience with the ECF program. So it sounds as if you first applied for funding on your own, and then in a second round, you didn't apply directly, but you worked in a partnership with the Adult Learning Alliance. And then third, you end up funding these hotspots on your own dime. It sounds like without going through the ECF program. So could you explain, first, did I get that right? And also, could you explain what, in your view, was ECF successful, and or what is it that could make it more successful going forward?
Yes, that is correct. So we went through we went through 2 phases of ECF. The first phase, we did the hotspot lending program in-house in our libraries, and we checked the hotspots out through our ILS and with the barcodes and everything. However, that was very labor intensive as far as keeping up with them, and people bringing them back on time, and we just troubleshoot, like we were trying to troubleshoot issues with that. And then also, every time they were having to fill out a form, That's also a document that we were required by ECF to keep, and due to our privacy laws within our state, we don't keep any records for our patrons. And so that was a person's signature on a piece of paper saying that they have a need. And so now we have documents that have their name written on them for 10 years. We have to keep that. So that wasn't a good fit for us. So we chose to partner with the Adult Learning Alliance, and we still went through ECF, and they partnered with their, we didn't have to have library patrons at that point. So we partnered with the Learning Alliance, and so they have students that they work with, and they check out the hotspot for a month at a time. And so these students are actually participating in like GED classes or ESL, continuing education, and they've actually received a lot of certifications. And so we've watched them through like a 6-month period, and we're able to really get good analytics and good information. And these are people these aren't our patrons. These are people out in the community. They're not necessarily in our libraries all the time. So we didn't have to have their names and keep their records. The Learning Alliance was already doing that, on their end. So we opted to not continue the ECF program, just because of, the headaches that it had. They often required us to fill out paperwork that had already been paid, like already filled out. The turnaround time once we were contacted or we received a message in the portal, I had to have information. I wasn't allowed to contact anybody through email. I would have to go through the portal to do everything, but it was already things that I had already done to do the forms. And when I'm the only one doing that, it was very difficult for me and time consuming. And so we just chose to cut back on the number of hotspots that we were doing. Realistically, we could triple the number that we have. So now we only have 25, and we started out with like 125. But we did ask the service provider if they would work with us on pricing, and we told them the situation, and we didn't receive any help from the service provider. So we just have used our small equipment money, and we've added it into our budget, and that means other things have to go. But we do feel like this is something that we need to pursue, and we see lives being changed. I mean, when someone is earning a certificate and they're getting jobs, we're pouring back into our communities through this program, and there's no denying that. So anyway.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. So if I could paraphrase and tell me if this is wrong, but it sounds to me as if you would support folding the ECF program into E-rate if the paperwork burden were reduced and if the privacy laws were adhered to, so that the library wasn't sacrificing the privacy interests of your patrons.
Yeah, if the paperwork process was much more like E-rate, I believe that it would have been less cumbersome. I mean, I do the E-rate paperwork, and I feel like ECF was just a completely different can of worms. And if it were, it resembled E-rate, then I think that there would be no issue with that. That's a personal thing, but I feel like that was my major point of contention. It just did not make sense. It was completely different, and it didn't make sense.
Hey, John, if I could just pipe up here, the story that Misty is sharing with us today is not one that is unique to her part of the country or the size of her school district. There are people in the largest school districts in the United States who would sit in a room with her and say, "Amen, sister, it's a real problem." And those school districts in many instances aren't making the tough choice that she's making. they're just saying we have to suspend the program. We're not going to be able to take this free internet connectivity and let the consequences be what they are. And that's really unfortunate.
Well, that's very true. And I've heard that as well, Misty, that your experience, you're not alone. That a lot of libraries have felt that way, that the paperwork burden was just much too cumbersome and onerous. So that's a good recommendation, though, to the FCC as they think about this Learning Without Limits program going forward. But Russ, I want to come back to you. You talked about putting antennas on the rooftop of the school building and working with IERA, a local WISP. I'd like to ask you to expound on that a little bit, because that sounds very similar to Shelby's philosophy of to and through, of deploying broadband, not just to the anchor institution, but through the anchor institution as a way to reach the home. And it sounds like you've actually been carrying that forward. So can you tell us more about that program and whether ECF supported that?
Yes, we did this outside of ECF, but the carriers is leveraging ACP in some shape or form to help them with their infrastructure. And so what we have is 5 of our sites that we're piloting it with. And you would think, especially California, we think of Silicon Valley. Of course, we have all the rural areas, but even some of these large farm areas, and some of our schools are out in that area, there's no internet access, just huge, vast lands. And then some of the workers for those farms, they don't have internet access. So our schools are in that proximity. So it's a perfect solution. And so what will happen is the family, we're working with the vendor to create a portal, a web portal, and we'll walk them through. We have a help desk that parents and students call in for support, which is interesting. I remember starting in education 28 years ago. I would never think I'd have a help desk where students could call about access at home or their parents to get their students connected. We just didn't have that mindset. And now that's what it is. It's almost like a 5-day a week, 7 a.m. to 5. So they go to a portal and they fill out a form in terms of their internet access demands and their needs. And then the carrier that we're working with, the local WIS, will have just like a normal service call, a ticket created, and then they go out to the home of the parent and the student in the scheduled time, and they get the connectivity back to the internet. And it's not traffic that comes to through our institution, and just using the infrastructure of our tower space as well as power to that.
So has that been a successful program? What's the take rate been?
Well, this is in the pilot stage. So I would say if we were a restaurant, we're soft rollout. We had a couple, we've had maybe 6 customers come through, and this next school year will be the testing period. So the first couple months, we're going to keep it to that pilot of those 6 locations. And then by the end of September, we'll determine to roll it out to all approximately 34 school sites spread throughout the Modesto area in our county.
And are you doing that because there's no existing cell phone provider that can serve the area with hotspots?
It's some of it is definitely that there is just not a business model for carriers. And I'll be honest, is that I've worked around E-rate, and I believe in sustainability. And sometimes these federal programs make me very nervous. So I feel like in my fiduciary duty, it is to find other sustainable strategies that leverage private enterprise. I don't take that wrong. We all need and love E-rate and ECF, but I also don't want to be at the whim of some political change in administration, and then all of a sudden my students are not having access. So it's kind of doing that, our due diligence. We want to help preserve federal and state funds, as well as I think it's a long-term sustainable strategy to partner with private enterprise when you can.
Gotcha. Well, those partnerships can be very valuable. I want to go back in reverse order this time. And the other thing that I've heard is sometimes schools and libraries purchased hotspots and deployed them, but then they didn't work, or the signal wasn't strong enough. So Russ, can you say if that was a problem for you, and then Misty, and then ask for Clint to respond? Go ahead.
Sure. We had a little bit of problem. We actually spread our business between Khajiit, the T-Mobile, and then we worked with some of the other carriers because as mass quantities, not all of them had it. So we had a little bit of problem, but we'd switch carriers. But one of the points before we jump back through is I just really want to emphasize earlier that usage management is the Achilles heel of the ECF program for schools, and I'm sure for libraries, is that we deploy them. And I'm just not in a political position to take back devices from students. Geographically, there's issues with that, as well as equity of access. So that's one of the points that I'm not sure I hit on earlier, but It's really important that as they dissect the program and that the usage issue doesn't become a penalty for a district that's applying or a library, because there's maybe some other parameters that we can use that doesn't become a big stick with the program and paying back funds. So sorry, I kind of skirted it, but I just wanted to hit that one home.
Well, I want you to go just a little bit further. Are you saying you're worried that if you deploy a hotspot and doesn't generate the traffic that you expect, that you're worried you could be dinged or fined by USAC?
Yeah, definitely that they'll ask for the funds back, because you have a numerous amount of scenarios. You give it to the family, and in our case, sometimes they go back to Mexico for like over a month or so, and then now I'm dinged because there's zero usage on that, and it's really hard sometimes to get a hold of those families. So as an educational institution, there's a lot more risk involved with participating in ECF sometimes than actually just going on your own means to pay it out of other fund sources, or which is the downside too, or do not give that access to those students because of the fact you don't have other funding or sources. So yeah, that ding that you could get, and again, you got to remember that E-rate has a reputation that they can go back 5-10 years and keeping those records. It just makes applicants very nervous about leveraging this program.
Very interesting. All right, thanks for bringing it to our attention. Let's hope that, well, as we work on this NPRM, I think that's an important comment that we should file in our comments. By the way, I do want to recognize the active chat conversations that Bob Boker and Julia Legg have been engaged in here in the chat, and I welcome that information that both of you have provided, as well as some of the questions that are coming up. I'm going to try to get to some of those, but Misty, back to you. What is your experience with the usage of the hotspots that you deployed?
Well, I showed you a picture of what the Arkansas River Valley looks like. So we're old school, and we keep little maps of our counties. And if it does not work, we mark it on the map. And if it doesn't work in that area and people bring it back and they say, this doesn't work at my house. And then I have a talk with the service provider and say, this does not work. I know what your map says, but this does not work in this location. So you probably need to fix that. And I've had a few little conversations with our service provider, and that is fine. But I just need them to know that that's realistic for what we're dealing with here. But we just take it and we put little dots, and we have circles around do not give to this area. And
are these areas, Misty, that you determined in advance by checking with the wireless internet provider in advance, and you were told that they do have service there, and then you deployed the hotspot, and it turns out it didn't really have service? Is that what I'm hearing?
yes.
Okay. All right. And Clint, are you aware of this as an issue? Has this crossed your radar from T-Mobile?
Well, the folks in our business, that this is probably an issue that they hear a lot about. What I will say to Misty and the folks on this call, and I will place my contact information in the chat, and John, you are free to disseminate that anywhere you'd like, that if you are encountering problems like this, I hope that you would feel comfortable reaching out to me to let us know. T-Mobile is embarked upon one of the most ambitious build outs of 5G in the history of our country, where 99% of the population will be covered by 2025, 90% of the areas that are deemed rural. This is a process that is always ongoing, and I believe that our coverage will continue to improve and be able to serve the needs of our customers. But if there's someone today who's got a story like the one that Misty has shared and that Russ has shared, I hope that you won't hesitate to reach out to me and let me serve as a conduit to the business to make sure that this isn't a problem. These are—
And John, this really points out there's not one size that fits all, right? You have wireless, you have WISC, you have Internet Essentials from the traditional Comcast and carriers out there. So it's going to be kind of a family of opportunities, so to speak.
That's right.
We've had this discussion too. Just because a person has fiber to the home, or just because if their equipment is bad, that it will not work. I mean, it's not going to be its full potential. You know, we had the same instance in our own libraries where we had to redo all of the wiring. And, you know, those kind of things are things that a lot of people do not have any idea about until they know. And it is our responsibility to educate people that, you know, you may have fiber, you may have the best cell service in the world, but if you have old equipment, it's not going to be its full potential.
Oh, those are very good points. And it reminds me that an awful lot of people say, well, broadband should be a utility like electricity. And my response is, gosh, broadband is so much more complicated than electricity. It's, there's so many more devices and routers and connections that any one of those points could be a fail point. And so that's why it requires even more work to get broadband connectivity to everywhere. But I do want to try to address some of the questions. So Gary posted a question about satellite internet. Is that eligible for E-rate service? Does anyone know the answer to that question?
It depends. If they have a SPIN number of the provider and providing internet, then I would say it should be. I know some districts that have done that with rural locations, Hughes Satellite, and some other ones, and they've gotten some E-rate funding for it. But following all the other rules with E-rate, of course, filtering, etc.
I'm going to put the eligible services list in the chat to see. This is from the FCC. It looks like it's an appendix from one of their orders. It does specify that satellite, cable modem, DSL, least lit fiber, satellite, wireless are all eligible under this appears to be ECF. But I'm not gonna be the ultimate authority. I'm just gonna lead you to the place where you can get the information.
Yeah, we've been successful in a few of our rural locations. So.
Well, I happened to speak to a Starlink representative just a couple of days ago. I'll name drop at the White House event that I attended, and he said that Starlink had just obtained their SPIN to participate in the E-rate program. So it could be that going forward, that satellite service will be E-rate eligible. I'd like to ask a question about the eligibility of devices for ongoing E-rate support. So traditionally, E-rate has not supported devices like computers, laptops, and tablets, but the ECF program has supported those costs. And as I said in my introductory comments, I think about 13 million devices have been funded through ECF. So as the FCC looks at folding ECF into E-rate, what do you think about including devices? Should devices be funded through E-rate going forward?
I'll speak.
Sure, go for it.
So personally, I think they should, because when we had to we updated our wiring, we put the antennas on the building, a lot of things you're having to do on the up front, you don't have an opportunity to get reimbursed. So if there is a way for you to go and get equipment and, substitute funding somehow, that would work for in our situation, because we could use our funding for another area, like it's all under the same umbrella technology wise. But if we know we're planning to replace 2 computers here and 10 here or something like that, that helps us plan a little bit better. Wiring and stuff like that, it just has to happen right then. You can't really, it's hard for us to plan for that sort of thing. So computers, we can plan.
I'm sorry. I'm holding myself back. Been being around this program for 26 years. And Misty, I respect that, but I guess in my opinion, that would be the demise of E-rate. Districts, and I'm speaking specifically K-12, we have to have skin in the game. And about sustainability, if we aren't responsible, at least for the devices, they don't get maintained in the correct way. And I'll give you an example. My district has a 24% breakage rate. That's astronomical. I'm really trying to figure out how to crack that nut, hold people accountable. And we have to kind of learn from history of E-rate. there was this weird gray zone where we had people getting creative and turning servers into workstations. I think with the legislative aspect and the support, we would lose it over time, and the waste, fraud, and abuse for devices. If we think ECF is challenging, and I'll give you the kind of the scenarios, like you now, when you got those devices under ECF, you have to make sure they go home and they don't just come back to a cradle and sit in the back of the classroom, right? And that's a challenge right there, because you get into union issues with teachers and them not doing the appropriate use. And libraries may be a different animal with this, of course, than schools. But I would say, you know, I'm always for what's best, but I would say I'd rather have E-rate sustained and not have devices so that we don't bring it down from a political perspective.
All right, very interesting difference of views. You're both helping Shelby to discover what our position should be going forward. So we're going to continue this conversation.
You did a great job. That was like a Siskel Ebert kind of thing going on there, a little conflict there. Good job,
exactly, that's right. And no name calling, so I appreciate that too.
We all love each other.
We do. We all have the public interest in mind. Well, I do want to wrap up a bit here, and just to say I did speak to the FCC official, or one of the FCC officials yesterday, and my understanding is that this Learning Without Limits is a proposal that is going to be in an NPRM, a notice of proposed rulemaking, that is going to be circulating with the other FCC commissioners. So it's not a done deal. Even launching the proceeding requires an affirmative vote by the FCC commissioners. So, but assuming that the NPRM at least does get the votes to start the conversation, we're going to have a lot of work to do to develop our comments going forward to figure out how we can best advance our goals of solving the digital divide, solving the homework app, while also being fiscally careful that we don't run afoul of the laws and don't run into these waste, fraud, and abuse problems that Russ has pointed out. So I really appreciate everybody's contributions to this conversation today. This has been enormously informative and educational. So thank you. I do want to just not just thank you, but also refer people to our upcoming conference. The Shelby Coalition AnchorNets conference is coming up on October 10th through the 12th. And we would love to see you there. Here's the link. The shorter link is just go to shelbyconference.org. But it's going to be in the Crystal Gateway Marriott in Crystal City, Virginia, right outside, close to the Reagan National Airport. So we hope to see you there. And if you'd like to consider joining Shelby as a member, we'd welcome that too. We have about 332 members today. We're always growing. We're always looking for new members. So if you like this webinar, which we provide free to the public, but we have even more in-depth conversations among our membership. So you're all welcome to contribute and join our organization if you'd like. So thank you so much. Thank you again to our corporate sponsors, ENA by Zayo and Broadband.Money. And thank you for joining this webinar. Bye-bye now.
Thank you for having us.